Hello, and welcome to the Tonic Accord. I don't know about you guys, but it seems like in this current political landscape, each podcast, news source, or opinion comes with a spin. Sometimes the spin takes you to the far left, other times the far right. Sometimes you don't even know that the spin is there, but in general, there seems to be a lack of a moderate voice in the media and in politics. Here at the Tonic Accord, we are truly hoping to help the middle get a voice, and to provide people with a centered and balanced message. A tonic chord is a very important reference in many forms of music. It describes two extreme notes, a high and a low, resonating simultaneously. In this chord, the addition of the middle note helps anchor down the sound, and it creates somewhat of a harmony and agreement between the other, more extreme notes. This can be a good metaphor for the importance of cooperation and discussion in politics. A country needs a moderate and sensible center to bring the outer extremes together. Good harmony is not only important for everyone, but it is better for the social fabric. And with that, let's get after it. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord. My name is Alex Kapitko. I studied political science and Spanish at Chapman University, and I'm currently working in Spain.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drew Nepley. I also studied political science, and I studied cultural anthropology at Chapman University. I'm currently working in political media in Los Angeles. Today, we have a doozy of an episode. Why don't you introduce us to what's going on today, Alex?
Yeah, so, it's just been a crazy week news-wise. And I was thinking to myself a few nights ago, I really wanted to do an episode that really dives into the economic, domestic, and foreign policies of Donald Trump. I think this is really important because although he's covered daily on social media and on the news, there isn't an actual discussion on the pros and cons of his policies.
Right.
Obviously, he's been heavily in the news this week after his tweets about the four newly elected congresswomen, and I just wanted to off the bat make it clear that they're racially insensitive. But I think it should be said that Trump is treated and analyzed, in my opinion, harsher than any other president, mainly because he doesn't speak like a politician. And he really struggles watching his words. So, Drew, I just wanted to frame our discussion today from the lens of his international policies involving China and the tariffs. And then I'd like to discuss the domestic side to his policies, mainly with the tax cuts. So I think we probably could have a lot to talk about on this, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's start digging in. Foreign policy. I think let's start from the beginning, right? So when he came into office, his whole notion was America first, which was the idea that, whether it's allies or enemies, he would put the needs of the United States first. And I think in Donald Trump's terms and mind frame, a lot of that has to do with economic benefits, right? So anytime he's dealing with a deal, I think the Trump administration has approached it from how does this economically benefit the United States, even with stuff that's not necessarily only about economic benefits, such as, denuclearization with North Korea. They often frame it as, stability in the region for trade and stuff like that. And then he, and the other things is he recognizes that other states around the world have their right to seek things that benefit their state first. So it's a very much of the America first idea from the get-go. Part of what that meant was getting rid of where Trump thought the United States was getting shafted in certain agreements, whether that be NAFTA or whether that be trade agreements and just the overall trade policy with China. The Trump administration viewed those as that needed to go and needed to be changed. And for the last few years, that's a lot of what foreign policy has been dealing with is China, and as well as getting rid of NAFTA and trade with basically any partners. Any trade partners, almost every single trade deal the United States has been a part of is now being reevaluated by the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And I think this comes back to his just character as a person. I mean, we have to remember, his whole life has kind of been transactional. I think he kind of sees the world as a zero sum. I win, you lose. There's no mutual agreement. There's no mutual success. It's always, well, I cut wage fees for my company. I make more money. I screw over my supplier, my manufacturer, and instead I make more money, you lose, you know?
Right.
And so I think he's very black and white. And I think unfortunately, the world is a gray disaster.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I think that's a good way to put it, right? So like anytime he talks about trade deals, it's who's getting shafted, right? You're either the one getting the better end of the deal or the one getting the worse end of the deal, in his view, and so he wants to make sure that America is getting the better end of the deal. Often,
Completely.
often though, is I find that some of these trade, like especially with someone like the United States, right? Like NATO, where the United States does pay the most and provide the most security and defense forces and money behind the NATO agreement. He sees that as, oh, we're taking on most of the load, and all these smaller countries are barely contributing. But the idea is that, in my opinion, it's like, well, something like NATO is like, it's not about the amount. It's not about like who's getting shafted. It's about maintaining a very strong alliance against powers that want to take down Western democracies. And so
Completely.
it's not always about who's getting the best deal. Sometimes you might sacrifice more for the long-term benefits of like a strong alliance in the West. Um,
Correct. Correct. Yeah. I mean, and I listened to an interview with Ash Carter. He was the former U.S. Secretary of Defense under Obama. And he had a good point. He said he understands where this critique is why do we have a base, in so many countries, and why are we so militarily and diplomatically involved in all these countries? And he basically said that to me, seeing a base, say, in Germany and in Turkey and in Korea, means that we have established a world order that really hasn't broken since World War II.
right.
And the fact that we have not had a large crisis break out means that we're probably doing something that's working.
Yes. Yes. I completely agree. I think that's one of my. I mean, let me be fair that like there are some things in terms of foreign policy that I think are beneficial to the United States. But I think one of my
Right.
largest gripes is that I think Trump is not respecting the alliances that we have made, or even if or treating our allies with respect. Because I think there's I mean, Angela Merkel of Germany earlier this year said Germany can no longer rely on the U.S. to be a promoter of European and Western values, and it's like that's kind of scary, right? Of course, we're still allies with them now. It's not like the house is completely fallen, but just the
Mm-hmm.
fact that I think a lot of, especially European powers, they're seeing how Eastern Europe is becoming more nationalistic. They're seeing how Russia is able to get away with election rigging pretty much, and they're scared, right? And the U.S. is no longer, an ally that they can lean on, an ally that they can go to view the world the same way as they do, and the U.K. included, right? So Germany looks at the U.K. and the U.S. going very different ways than the rest of Western Europe, and I think that it hurts us. It hurts our alliances. Our alliance with Canada, with NAFTA getting redrawn into the United States Mexico Canada agreement, but not and this wasn't redrawn in like a room where everyone was having champagne while they're doing it. This was after tweet storms and saying Canada is a national security threat. I think a lot of these alliances that for decades, if not hundreds of years, we've held dear. Donald Trump just doesn't recognize or really care about, and I think that could be harmful.
Yes, I 100% agree. I mean, the way I've always thought of it is that he seems to abuse our allies and honor our enemies. And I mean, on the other side of it, I do feel that there is a bit of rationale to try to play hardball and the BFF of Kim Jong Un. Like, obviously, there's not enough hard evidence to say that it's worked, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think that trying to play someone at their own game is probably better than. I mean, for his defense, Obama, Trump, Clinton, Obama, Bush, and Clinton all have attempted to work with these powers. They've attempted to work with Putin. They've attempted to work with Kim Jong Un. They've attempted to deal with the Iraq crisis. And I mean, all of them have pretty much failed. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I just think that, I guess the only thing I admire about what he's trying to do is that at least maybe he's trying to give it a shot to actually sit down and play tit for tat, I guess.
Yeah, no, I
I mean,
mean,
there's yeah,
where that's one of the things I do agree. Like, the fact that he is going to North Korea and meeting with Kim Jong Un, that's all good. That's all progress in my opinion, right? Like you mentioned, he's the first president since I think it was like ever or since 1970s to even like talk with a North Korean leader. Of course, he recently just was the first president to step foot in the country. He just crossed the DMZ, like 15
yeah,
feet across. But these are all big things, right? And that's all good progress. And I agree. Like in that scenario, I would much rather our leaders be shaking hands and taking photos with North Korea instead of threatening nuclear destruction, which was, by the way, happening in the beginning of the administration. I remember in
right.
2017 there was that famous tweet about his big red button is bigger than Kim Jong Un's, which is just so
Yeah.
hilarious. Looking back, it's hilarious. At the time, it was kind of scary. But no,
Now
you're
it's like,
right.
yeah, are we dead tomorrow?
You're right. I mean, like, the whole Sun Tzu Art of War, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I think
Right.
that's fine, but I also don't think that Trump is the foreign policy master to do that effectively, right? Like I think North Korea is only willing to meet with Donald Trump because they feel that they can maybe take advantage of his strongman personality.
Good point.
And the other thing too, right? So what's the point of North Korea? It's all about denuclearization anyway. And every expert that I've heard talk on, CNN, NPR, whatever, they've all said that like this is all a good step in the right direction, but we're going to need way more than just a few handshaking meetings to figure this out. It's going to take a lot of verification, a massive, it's going to take a massive amount of manpower and understanding and diplomacy to pull this off. So hopefully we'll see. I mean, in February it kind of went back. They had that summit that kind of fell apart, and then now
Right.
in June they've shook hands and took photos again. So right now it's just kind of photos in my eyes. Nothing really has happened except for photos and good press, which is still good, but we'll see how that progresses. But as far as other leaders, as far as like you were mentioning about enemies, like there's stuff where he's talked to Putin about wishing he could jail some press, and talking to the leader of China about. Like he doesn't seem to be promoting democracy when talking to some
Right.
of these anti-democratic leaders, and that
Right,
also
yeah.
worries me.
Right. No, and I just want to touch back on the Korea thing. Sorry, real fast.
Sure.
Um I think that basically the way I would sum up his both domestic and international policies are one step forward, two steps back. Like he basically, he talks to Kim Jong Un and actually seems like he does truly want to make this issue better. But then his policies, his protectionist, nationalist kind of ideals are now wearing off, because The Economist today had an interesting article that said a brawl now underway in Asia between Japan and South Korea has the potential to be as damaging as much of what Mr. Trump has stirred up. Basically, it's saying that Japan is now using Trump's own playbook and blaming South Korea for talking with the North Koreans, and is saying that they've been cheating them in bank statements and other financial accounts. So basically, other countries are now starting to take out of Trump's playbook that, we don't need our allies. We're going to go, Japan first. And so the problem is with North Korea, if we actually want anything done, obviously we need cooperation with Japan and South Korea.
Yeah.
But it's his policies that, first off, he wants us to work towards North Korea, but then it's his protectionist kind of combative foreign policy that is now putting other nations down that same road. So it's like you really can't get both.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, South Korea and Japan have hated each other for a long, long time.
Right.
But you're right though that like the whole our country first and kind of like putting your what used to be small grievances at the forefront, right? Like, in the grand scheme of the United States foreign policy, the fact that our NATO allies spent less on it than we did was such a small problem. It was a non-issue that Trump has now put at the forefront of like pay your share or we won't protect you. I mean, and that's just like, oh my gosh, like making an issue out of nothing and threatening a serious alliance. And like, I mean, nationalistic and our country first ideas are flourishing all over the world. You have it in Ukraine, you have it in the UK, you have it in Austria, you have it in Japan, like you just mentioned. And it's a trend on the upswing.
Right. And I don't think he is at all responsible for it or was involved in the beginnings of it. But I think that he gave it a validation when he won the presidency of the richest
Yeah.
country in human history.
He's now the
And
largest proponent of it.
exactly, and I think there's a little bit of Trump mania. I don't think that he is the same as say Hungary's president or Vladimir Putin or Duterte in the Philippines.
No.
But I think he has these tinges because he just is so interested in power, and I think for him it's power. Someone said power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. I think that's his issue, right? Because I don't know if a good person is going to become a total jerk if they're running something, but if you have tendencies, I think being a leader is just going to show those.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that was his whole world. His whole world is making good deals, becoming super successful, and making the most money you can. And it's like, that's very different than like promoting democracy around the world. Like it's a very, like the function of government is not to like get the most deals and be the most powerful. Unfortunately, that usually is what it is. But our function of government should be to promote human rights and good democratic values. You could call that Western values or whatever, but around the world. And I don't think Trump, like when Trump talks to leaders, he doesn't talk in terms of democracy and elections and freedom and responsible governance. He talks in terms of power. That's why he calls Duterte and says you're doing a good thing when you're using kill squads to crack down on drug offenders, which is like, that's extrajudicial crime, right? That's cruel and unusual punishment. And Trump is like, oh yeah, that you're exercising your power as Duterte. That's good stuff. And like, man, that's worrisome. Now, I don't think like we're going to get kill squads here in the States. Some people would argue, some people have argued that ICE is that. I don't know if I would go that far, but But yeah, you're right that his is in terms of power and deals, right? His whole thing, the art of the deal. It's all about deals. How can America get the best deal out of something?
Completely. And so I want to move along a little bit to China because I think, especially our generation in our lifetime and currently, China is probably the biggest topic in foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I think they're the one that we don't talk about enough because we have so many issues in the Middle East, Russia, Venezuela. But I think China is the sleeping, well, not a sleeping dragon anymore. It's like Daenerys' dragon, maybe season 3.
Yeah. All the spies have said, "Look, man, this girl's got dragons. She's coming over eventually. We got to figure something out."
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah. I don't know if you want to maybe lay over a little background on what's been going on with the administration in China.
Yeah. Well, then this is back to where I was talking before. This is one of the areas where I think Trump has had some success and had addressed an issue that I think no other politician was really having the balls to address, frankly, because Trump is right that China is very smart and had been, for the last decade, engaging in currency manipulation, stealing of technologies from Western countries, but because of how economically entwined the U.S. and China are, it's been hard to enforce and crack down on some of these, basically cheating the system, cheating the game, right? China has no problem manipulating its currency at the detriment to its own people for a long-term financial gain.
Totally.
And so Trump in the 2016 election, he called him out. He says, China is screwing us. China is really screwing us, and we are getting shafted in our deals with China. So he was right. He was right. And so what he's been doing, right, is he's been engaging in this quote unquote trade war. I don't know if it's a full on war, more like a trade kerfuffle. But it's the idea that he's going to impose. He proposed 40% tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States. He wanted to give the American workers a level playing field. China has reacted with tariffs on some U.S. goods, and so it's led to some contention, and so that's why they've been doing in talks, right? The problem I have here is that a lot of the discussions and tariffs have been kind of disingenuous and a little bit clouded, right? When asked about stuff, Trump will say, "We'll see. We're figuring out. Xi Jinping and I had a good meeting. We're getting somewhere." And it's like, what is really happening? And then the other thing, my biggest problem, because again, I think he's addressing the problem that needs to be addressed, and sometimes you have to play hardball, and he's doing that. But he's been lying to the American people about it, because he said things like,
Yes.
we're going to impose tariffs, and not a single U.S. person will have to pay for it, right? They're going to pay for it, and we don't have to worry. And it's like, no, man, some people do have to worry. Soybean farmers do have to worry about this.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Some industries are really getting hit, and you kind of lied to them. It's one thing if it's like, hey guys, we're going to take a hit in some industries, but it's part of our plan, and we have an idea of how this will work out in the long run. But instead, they've been kind of, they've been really cloudy and mirrory and kind of disingenuous.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think the biggest issue I have with tariffs is that I think that tariffs are meant to be a reactionary measure for a short term, but he has turned them into a long-term policy goal. And I just think that it's very ingenuine, and like you said, it's a total lie. Because I think the hope, which I think is a genuine hope, and I can respect it, and I think most of Americans agree with it, left, right, center, anarchists, whatever, is that Trump hopes to bring jobs back to America. But unfortunately, the paradox is the opposite is actually going to happen.
Right.
The Atlantic says his tariffs are contributing to a generational shift. And basically, what it's saying is that companies are not going to bring the jobs back to the United States. Apple or Giant Bikes was actually an example where basically they make their bikes in China, but instead now they're looking at Vietnam and other Southeastern Asian countries, which there's a pro and a negative to that. Like the pro being it's actually going to help boost some poor countries in Southeastern Asia. The negative is that it's, again, doing what Trump is against, helping foreign countries take advantage of American companies.
Right.
And so it's just very interesting is that the more this goes down, reshoring as they call it, it's the Chamber of Commerce in China in a Chinese survey found that only fewer than 6% were actually considering coming back to the U.S. So this trade war is just very ingenuine, in my opinion. I mean, China needs to be called out, but I think it needs to be on an international scale, not a nation-by-nation scale.
Yes, and I think, like, you're absolutely right. Like, people are just like, okay, if I don't do business in China, I'll do business in Vietnam. And Chinese companies are doing the same thing as well. Okay, if I can't buy soybeans in the U.S., like I'll buy them from someone else. Like that's the thing is China and U.S. don't exist in a vacuum. There's a plethora of other countries that are also involved and being affected by this trade war that that are kind of left in the dust or left on the sidelines, or like you said, or they're the ones getting like, okay, great, Vietnam will now make those bikes, but like, wasn't the whole point America first, right? Like, it's not bringing any jobs back to the States. So, yeah, I think that's a big issue, and I think if you did want to take on China, right? China's economic influence over the region, and not just the region, but the world now. I mean, China's been doing a ton of development and deals in Africa. Is to do what they're doing, right? So we should invest in Africa. We're not. We're really not. We should invest in Africa as far as like we'll build infrastructure and stuff. We'll help create functioning democracies. Because what China's trying to do is spread their influence and economic wealth across the world, but so that they can have more power and more say in what goes on in the world. So
yes, and I think it's actually there's a very sinister side effect to that.
Absolutely.
Because I think that with the West slowly becoming, I think with democracy basically becoming less popular, I think China's almost given a option B
right
to a world order run by the U.S. And I'm obviously the U.S. needs to just dominate the world. But honestly, like we have our flaws, but I think we do believe in morality. And I really have a problem with, like recently, I think it was Greece and a few other Balkan states just sided with China on a UN Human Rights Council vote. And so I'm starting to worry that as this goes on, China's going to slowly start sucking up Africa and Eastern Europe. I think that China's now going to have enough sway to maybe veto something that's actually very important.
Yeah. As it might come down to, it might come down to like the basically concentration camps for Muslims in Western China. They'd be like, hey, well, we have enough allies in the UN that they'll vote no on everything you want. Like, it doesn't matter. We're good. We got we got our allies. And so that's a big issue, right? Is Trump is taking on China, and we needed to do that. And I'm kind of okay with the idea of like taking an economic hit now for a better, a better relationship, and not getting our intelligence stolen and stuff in the future. I'm okay with a little bit of an economic hit. The problem is that it was lied, like the problem was it was lied to the American people that that wouldn't happen, and that we're not going about it in a way that increases our allies and influence in the region.
Yeah.
We're kind of isolating ourselves.
Oh, completely. And I think as we get more separated, China starts moving into Europe more and more. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is insane.
Right. The Belt and
I
Road.
mean, they have Pakistan, they have Kenya, they have about, I think, 4 or 5 Eastern European countries. And they already have, I mean, I live in Spain most of the year, and they have a large influence. I mean, I'd say about 2 out of 3 people I talk to have Huawei phones, And yeah, they have amazing cameras and they're cheap, but they're owned by an ex-military leader. I don't know if he's a general or admiral, but you just have to question the motives, because I think in China, the private sector and the public sector are just very blurred.
I remember, yes. Well, absolutely. There's no, like, kind of a side topic, but definitely related, right? One of my hobbies is playing a lot of video games. This is related, believe me. And there's a problem in a lot of popular video games of Chinese hackers, guys that will change their VPN to go on U.S. servers and hack the game. And people were so upset. Like, it was almost always, people would track the IPs when they could back to China. And I was like, what is with these Chinese hackers? And then a guy on Reddit, now again, this is just a guy on Reddit, so don't take this as great, like, absolute. But he was saying he lived in China, and there's a cultural difference between China and the West in terms of cheating and rules. In China, the idea is that if you can bend or ignore the rules to win, why wouldn't you? You win in the end, and that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to be on top and to win. So they don't see cheating as an issue. Whereas in the United States, we're very, hey, we shook on it. We set some ground rules. You can't do that. That's cheating. There's a cultural difference. And so when you are dealing with a country like China, it's important to remember, like, they will do whatever it takes to be on top, because that's what they see as the most important. The Communist Party in the state that runs China, of course they're going to work with quote unquote private companies to do intelligence, data, mining and whatever.
Yeah, it's horrifying to me, actually. And, I think the only issue I have, though, is that I think that if we push China into a corner, we're going to create a multi-poled world. And I think that I just worry that basically it would just create an economic Cold War. Like the Economist has an interesting quote. It was about the trade war. It says, in fact, closer financial links could have a beneficial effect, which is why longtime China watchers back them so strongly. When Chinese firms have foreign shareholders or underwriters, their calculations change. They face tougher questions, as Alibaba is reminded on every earnings call. None of this will suddenly transform China into a free market, but it will encourage the firms to be more open, to respond to market signals, and to respect intellectual property. And I think intellectual property is the key. But I just worry that if we stop sharing with them and working with them, it'll only make the issue worse.
Oh, absolutely. All this whole trade war stuff, it has to be temporary. Like you said, tariffs have to be a temporary solution. They cannot be a long-term policy, because exactly like you said. I mean, if we isolate ourselves and we isolate China, we're just going to lose influence in the region. And think about it from one of these third-party countries, right? If you are a Vietnam, you're thinking, well, because Vietnam is not the Vietnam of the Vietnam War.
No.
For those out there, Vietnam is actually becoming more capitalist. It had its first billionaire who was a female. It's developing very differently than how I think a lot of people expected. But if you are that country, right, you're right under the shadow of China. You have to be like, well, I have to have relationships with China, but I also want to have economic relationships with the U.S. And it's almost like two divorced parents now trying to pull you one way. You have to decide, who am I going to side with, and why, And so that puts a lot of other countries in a unique and unfortunate position, that we might find that countries we thought we were homies with are now going to be like, look, man, I have to ally with China because this is crazy, and this is ridiculous, and they're right there.
Yeah, completely. And so, yeah, what happens? I mean, if we try to pull our military out of some of our very centralized locations in Europe and Southeast Asia, what do our allies say? I think it's a valid concern, and people just don't. Unfortunately, people don't trust us anymore, and China's getting economic trust. They're building
Yeah.
up infrastructure in really poor countries in Africa, and they're pretty much just doing what I think any smart growing power would do is, hey, here's something now, and I scratch your back, you scratch mine eventually.
Yeah, we'll build a freeway across your entire African nation, but like when push comes to shove, you're gonna side with us when we need it.
Yeah, there's some worries actually about that freeway, is that it's actually just built to help mobilize Chinese troops and infrastructure quickly if it was needed. Obviously, that's only hearsay, but there are concerns about why they are building up all this infrastructure.
Oh yeah, it's all ulterior motives. I don't buy for a second that China has now become this philanthropist country that wants to help develop Africa. It's like, come on, like no, they want something to gain, whether it's military mobility or economic power or UN power. It's all one of those things. Now, I'm glad that some countries are waking up to the idea that Africa is developing and could be a major player in the world. I think that is going to be the case in the next 20, 30 years. Is Africa
Yes.
will develop a lot. I think things like smartphones, internet is going to be widespread through that entire continent, and it's going to change the world. So now it's okay. Do we do it in a way that the U.S. can get involved? We can promote good democracies and human rights and have economic ties and maybe do good business, or are we going to let China do it all before us, and then turn them into autocratic or less than democratic countries, right?
And yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a great point. And I mean, my question to you is, because I personally fear that Africa will probably develop more to the model of the Middle East than to Europe, because I think it's been a historically tribal society, and I wonder if, yeah, because I mean, you're right. I think in the next 50 years, they say Lagos, Nigeria, will be the biggest city in the world, and I do question that if Africa develops, will it develop democratically, or will there be another more authoritarian build? I mean, because obviously history does not look good in Africa with democracy, and I kind of wonder. Yes, because I think you're right. Africa is going to have a huge progression in the next 100 years, but I feel like China could really take advantage of that.
Yeah. No, yeah. Unfortunately, I think like it's definitely gonna develop quickly, and it's gonna be an economic player more so than it already is. But I also fear, like you said, I fear that it's just gonna be similar to its history. It's gonna be extorted and taken advantage of, by major powers, right? And by international companies. So we'll see. I mean, but that's right. That's my point. Is the U.S. foreign policy kind of doesn't really care about Africa, and other major powers do, and so we
Right.
should care about Africa, and we hopefully should promote good policies in the continent, because I think you're right. I think other players will just extort the continent, extort those nations, like those nations have been extorted by foreign powers for hundreds of years before that.
Oh, completely. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. I don't really. I I feel like basically what needs to happen is the international community, not just one nation, needs to come together and almost give China a policy-based ultimatum.
Yeah, and that's where Donald Trump is falling short. He
Yeah.
he wants to play hardball with China himself, and he thinks he can be the deal maker. And it's like, dude, you cannot isolate yourself like this. Like, the world is so complex. We need to have a multinational. We need to have tons of allies in our corner. We need to have Europe in our corner. And it's all these other things that he's doing, right, that are weakening that. So it's all related, right? Like his idea, his working with China is going to be harder if we don't have allies like Angela Merkel, or I
Hmm.
mean, gosh, whoever's in charge of the UK. I think Boris Johnson's next.
Oh, that
So
actually reminds me of an issue I didn't even bring up yet about Trump's foreign policy. Is it was the cover of the Wall Street Journal today, pretty much saying that it could be the end of our alliance with Britain as we know it. After Sir Nigel Kim, I think it's Derek, the U.S. ambassador or the British ambassador to the United States was fired
Right.
or resigned. I think it was. I think he resigned. And just the souring relations. It's like they've been our best allies since World War II, and I don't know how far that alliance goes. But do you think it's almost better maybe if it is Boris and Trump, because at least they agree on things?
Yeah, I mean, foreign policy maybe, but again, it would Boris and Trump together is one thing, but them two together would probably go against the rest of Western Europe, right?
Totally.
Boris is a Brexiter, Trump is an America First guy. It's like where does are they going to be productive with Macron and Merkel and whoever else comes to power? Because I think Merkel's almost done. But whoever else comes to power in these Western European nations that are the major players. Now, you're right. I mean, it's interesting. You're right. Like, I see what you're saying, right? That Boris and Trump will get along better. But I think outside of that fact, I think it's still bad.
Oh no, totally. And I mean, Trump looks really good compared to Boris. I mean,
Gosh.
Boris sounds like a basket case.
Yeah. That's true.
I mean, say what you want. At least Trump's married and doesn't have I think it was a cocaine problem currently. I don't know what exactly it was, but
I remember seeing that funny video of Boris getting like stuck on like a parachute ride or something. Like he was doing some little stunt and he got like stuck, so people had to like take him, like carry him down from his pants. Just hilarious.
Jeez.
Just hilarious.
He's a character.
It's good. It's a good time to be a British cartoonist. That's for sure.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, the last thing I have to ask you is, does it, at least on this international side, does it bother you? Like, because I know you use the numbers that Obama was much more popular to Germans, or UK citizens preferred Obama like 10-1 to Trump. Like, do you think those numbers really matter? Because do you think it matters how foreigners view the president, like foreign citizens in a more liberal country think about the president?
It's not a priority, I don't think, but I do think that it's like I don't know, it's a data point worth looking at, like especially if it's something egregious, right? Like if it's like the vast majority of French people really don't like the president, instead of like a teetering, like a 45. It's like he's always between 40% and 53% liked, like again, it's one of those things that it's in the overall context. It's the overall context of are we with our allies, are we respecting our agreements, and then you can look at that as a data point. But I think overall it's not that important, right? Like I wouldn't start worrying if Liechtenstein started really hating our Secretary of State, like whatever. It's in the greater context, I think. What do you think though?
I'm very torn, because I was just thinking about this while you were responding to that, because I think you're correct, but that at the same time I almost say I don't really care, because I guess up until World War One, America has always been isolationist, and I think to a lot of Americans that was what our country was intended to do, especially these right wing originalists and constitutionalists. I think a lot of conservative Americans think that our nation just was not meant to be popular and involved in the world. And I think that after Iraq, we kind of looked in the mirror. And I think that was when the Republicans should have done a self checkup. But instead, you first had Sarah Palin, who I argue was probably the Trump 1.0. And then I think that there's just a large cry on the right to get back to kind of what did make America great again, which was isolationist, strong industry, a manufacturing core, probably less secular than it is now. But I think that just the world is changing. And I mean, Europe and the United States are much different. So I guess for me personally, like I run into Spanish people all the time that tell me just how much they can't stand Trump, and how they just can't believe he won. And I kind of actually always tell them, I can believe that he won. It actually, the more I've read about it, and 3 years in, I'm actually not as surprised as I once was.
Yeah. I mean, look, yeah, right. I get that, and like, because I mean, we could throw it right back at them, like, like look at Boris Johnson or or look at the fact that now, you have far right-wing Italian politicians that are speaking in nationalism, and you're like, bro, I mean, you don't see how Trump could get elected? Look at Europe, you know. So that's fair. I think also Europe has always and always will kind of think that they're a little bit above the United States.
Right.
Not and like that's fine, I guess. Because we're the most powerful country, but again, like I don't think like the opinions of the people, especially since they changed so much, should be taken into account greater than like our actual relationships with the leaders in the actual states.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And it's funny. I think everyone saw the transition from like into globalization as being pretty smooth. I think by now people thought globalization was kind of going to be the norm, and the world was going to truly just be a flat market. Like the world would literally just be flat. Not trying to say I'm a flat earther, but I think the issue is that no one really predicted this populist backlash. And I think we both were talking about that book. I think it was called Us Versus Them.
Yes.
Or something. And I think that book, everyone should really check that out. But it brings up a very interesting point, is that I think that a lot of political elites from the right and left in most of the world kind of just played globalist politics to get wealthier and help more elites. And I think China falls into that because I think previous presidential administrations thought about the strength of the economy over the strength of the worker. And so I think this populist backlash, I totally understand it to a certain extent, is that people are fed up with seeing politicians flying around on jets while they're dealing with having to have 2 or 3 jobs now because the job they have is now in China.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So,
or like multinational companies reporting record profits, but then the wages of their people making the phones are abysmal.
Yeah.
I think that's a good right there what you said about the economy, the strength of the economy versus the strength of the worker. I think that's a good point to switch into the domestic issues.
Yes.
Yes. Because the economy, right, has been so pivotal for this Trump administration. I think one of the reasons Trump still has such a strong base, and as far as I think it's he still gets 45 to 47% approval rating consistently for the last year, which is still not good. Let's be real, it's still not majority, but it hasn't been wavering much, and I think that's because of the strength of the economy, right? The S&P 500 just last week broke 3,000 for the first time ever. You're seeing 11 to 12% gains in the stock market per year since Trump came into office. But I think like we always do, we have to look at it in the context, right? Unemployment is the lowest it's ever been, or lowest since 2008, but unemployment was steadily decreasing since like 2010. And so Trump has inherited a good economy, and he's kept it good as far as stocks and unemployment.
Right.
But as far as wages, I think the strength of the worker, I think that needs to be looked at a lot more as far as domestic issues in the United States. What do you think?
Completely. I mean, I think that overanalyzing short-term data is never a good idea, because he hasn't, honestly, actually, between him and Obama, the economy's in a bull run like we haven't seen, I don't think, actually ever. I don't think the economy has been this vibrant ever, which is, I guess, he gets hounded by the media for saying that it's the best economy ever. But I think most economists do believe that it is actually, at least on bare numbers, one of the best, at least, economies we've seen. But the issue is that there are good policies, I think, that he has passed in some areas, but they're always being offset by bad policies. And it goes back to, again, that 1 step forward, 2 steps behind thing I was talking to you about, because and I think it's true, is that unemployment is an awful it's just an awesome quantifier, because it doesn't account for people that aren't looking for jobs. It doesn't account for people that can't get jobs. It doesn't account for part-time or under-the-table jobs. It doesn't account for illegal immigrants.
Right.
And so it's just not a very good indicator of an economy. I think maybe GDP can be, but I think actually like per capita would be interesting.
Right.
And I just don't actually think that just a good economy is enough to convince me that what he's done is good.
Yep. I'm on the same page. I mean, there's no doubt we live in a good economy, especially compared to a decade ago. There's no doubt. I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind can deny that. But does that mean that is this good economy one sustainable? I don't think so either. I think we're due for a recession in the next few years. Now, I'm not gonna bet any money on that, right? Anyone that tells you what's gonna happen to the stock market is just lying, because no one really knows. But with the volatility that I've seen, right? There was I think it was beginning of 2018. There was a huge, there was a massive readjustment in the market, like 20%. Now it since went back up and farther. But, that's a decent amount of volatility. The fact that the Fed has chosen not to lower rates is an indication that they see it as, well, it's good, but it's not stable. So, we have to like you said, exactly like you said, right? Unemployment is not the best factor to look at. You have to look at other things. Has wages for the average worker, have they increased? Well, not really, not very far.
And see, I mean, that's actually why I do wonder if raising the minimum wage is the correct way to do it. Because if the industries themselves don't actually require the worker or actually are doing maybe as well as we say they are, then I almost also feel like raising minimum wages is also just a false indicator. You know what I mean? Because I almost think that, it's just in general, most jobs in the United States are just not as valuable as they used to be.
It's true. It's true, and a lot of jobs
it's really tough.
Yeah, and a lot of jobs are gonna be on their way out.
Yeah, and it's really tough, is because it's basically like pretty much all of Trump's voters are actually going to be the ones who, like that middle America blue collar voter is actually the one who is probably already has been, and even more so down the road, is going to really face this the hardest, know? Yeah. And I really couldn't give you an answer of how we would fix this. And also it is worrying back to the economy right now, that the debt of non-financial businesses right now is at 74% of GDP. And I just don't think that that's a good indicator of a stable economy, exactly, like you had said.
Yeah.
And the only thing that does make me feel good is that there is no speculative bubble that is on par with the housing crisis. There is no indicator that there is a sector of the economy that could just collapse like that. And that is, I guess, one pro, but at the same time, it's just, I just don't see how sustainable it is. And also, I think that all of this talk is also dependent on our relationships with China, with Latin America,
right,
Russia, oil.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, like we said, we're not in a bubble, right? U.S. economy is not just here in its own vacuum. It's connected to the world. So a trade war with China has serious effect on middle America voters. Like the guy who has a soybean farm in Iowa is going to really feel it. And he's an Iowan. His vote matters way more than my vote does in California. Just based on the Electoral College. So, some of these things might come back to haunt Trump. But that's why Trump has been trying to support his base, right? And unfortunately, I think he's in trying to support his base economically, he's supporting the past, right? The whole idea that he wants to bring back coal, make coal strong again. It's like, dude, that's like trying to subsidize the horse and buggy when Ford is making cars. Like you're holding on to the past, and sure, you might bring back one coal mine in a small town and get 300 jobs. For how long though? And the town next to it is completely abandoned. I don't know. It's like this idea that he wants to focus more on fossil fuels and coal, and his buddy with he made Rex Tillerson from ExxonMobil, a foreign policy guy, and it's like not that Rex Tillerson is not the least qualified, but I wouldn't say he's the most qualified, and so the idea that he's really embracing like technologies that are going on the wayside for a short-term gain for appealing to his base is worrisome. It's just obvious to me that Trump is a very short-term guy.
Right, right. I mean, and it backs up. I mean, going off of that, because I think you're completely right. Is that I mean, it has to be understood that the administration is taking advantage of one of the largest oil booms in U.S. history. And that's a very short term way to be going about this. Because I mean, Forbes says that under the Trump administration, energy and mineral production activities on federal lands generated almost $10 billion, supporting federal, state, and local governments. So I mean, I don't know if I'm actually that against that. I mean, for environmental reasons, I could be, but at the same time, I mean, obviously, for a short term, we are making ourselves less reliant on Saudi Arabian oil, which is, I don't think, a bad thing. But at the same time, it's very short term because he's taken us out of the climate agreements. The EPA is pretty much just becoming an oil company.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's really ugly on that side of it. And it's all just for the moment. He's like that guy that just eats burgers every day and drinks himself to sleep every night just because it's fun for the moment. But when your doctor tells you you're dying in about 20 years, it's not as fun.
Yeah, exactly. Like what you said about oil, right? Like, America's more independent as far as its oil production and usage, and so we're less dependent on Saudi Arabian oil. That alone, that statement right there is, I think, a good thing. But what's the cost, right? The environmental cost. You're shredding the EPA to be a shell of what it once was. You're deregulating these industries so that they can do things that will absolutely come back to bite us in the future. If you were like, look, we need to get more independent, and the way to do that short term is to use some of our oil that we have in reserves in North Dakota and Alaska. But while we do that, we'll make sure it's regulated. We'll make sure the EPA is on it. We'll make sure it's not going to be polluted. We'll respect sovereign lands of Native American peoples. I would be kind of okay with it. Yeah, like, I want to get rid of oil, but if it means not supporting human rights violations in Saudi Arabia for a time, I'm down. But with all these other side things of like, and the oil companies are just gonna basically go hands free, government hands off, and then it's like, oh man, it's like we've been down this road before, and it's led to nothing but trouble.
Right. Very well said.
And it's not, and it's not supporting other renewable energies. If it's like, okay, we want to use some oil now while we need to, but we'll also be supporting and developing in renewable energies. That's another argument you can make that I think a lot of people could get behind. But it just seems to me that like Trump is embracing the past because it's people living in the past that support him. Or in certain areas, in certain states, right? In the coal areas of the Appalachians and the farming areas of the Midwest. These people are like, I think that they're obviously anxious about AI and the changing of energies in the global world because they should be anxious. The world is changing. They're going to lose their jobs. But this is not how we solve that problem.
Not at all. Not at all. I think that's a good point. And yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a guy at a restaurant a few nights ago. And we started talking about politics and I mean, pretty much agreed on everything. But he asked me a great question. He's like, he was a conservative, and he basically was like, so what do I tell you if I can't stand Donald Trump, but about half the policies done I actually agree with? And I think that is the issue that Republicans are going to have to. I think they're starting to, but they're going to have to face more. Is that what happens when it's a president who is inherently immoral, but he is actually getting things done that no other Republican might have been able to do?
Yeah, I can imagine that's where many a conservative probably find themselves now is, look, I can't stand the guy. I wouldn't want to have a beer with him. But, in their eyes, he's better than the alternative, which would have been Hillary Clinton. I can see how a lot of people think that. But I don't know. Again, it's like, it's a justified anxiety that a lot of these middle Americans have. But I think it's a misguided their ideas are misguided because the solution that's being presented to them is not a solution that's going to last forever. I mean,
right.
If you want to restart coal mines in Kentucky, you're going to have that same conversation in 15 years because that same town is going to become a deserted town again. Opioid crisis is ravaging these communities. It's not a long-term solution. And so it's a shame that some people, I feel, got, kind of swindled into thinking that their situation would change when it's really not. And people had that same opinion about Obama. There was one guy famous on a Vice documentary who was a coal miner. He said, I voted for Obama twice. I voted for him both terms, and because he said he would support blue collar middle America, and he's like, and it didn't happen. So then I voted for Trump, and because he said he'd support blue collar middle America, and I bet you that's not going to happen. So it is a shame that these people are kind of getting swindled by politicians, left and right.
I want to jump over real quick to the tax cuts, because obviously, if you're a staunch fiscal conservative, you were probably clapping when those were passed in December of 2017. I just wanted to read something real quick. Basically, Mike Solon, he's a former budget staffer on Capitol Hill, basically said the success is harder than ever to deny. After Friday and June's report, the U.S. economy grew 4.1% in the second quarter, bringing the average quarterly growth rate during the Trump presidency to 2.9. I want to note in the Trump presidency, not just in the economy since Obama reinvigorated it. In the first 5 quarters of the Trump presidency, growth has been almost 40% higher than the average rate during the Obama years, and per capita growth in domestic product has been 63% faster. The CBO now projects that additional revenue from this economic surge will offset 88% of the estimated 10-year cost of the tax cut. Then the CBO's April revision projected an extra $6.1 trillion in GDP over the next decade, more than $18,000 of growth for every man, woman, and child in America. I mean, obviously the verdict is still out on that, but it is an interesting rationale that they're saying the economic surge will offset almost 90% of the tax cut. Like, is that how we should be doing economic math?
Yeah, well, again, that's if the economy's good for the next 10 years.
Right.
It's kind of like betting on it, right? It's like, okay, well, if things are really good, then it'll pay for itself or pay for 90% of itself. But that's if things are good.
Right. And yeah, so it's like, but I mean, I think that's just such a very strange way to justify it,
Yes.
is that, I mean, because it's really true that this tax cut was super lopsided for corporations and wealthier Americans,
Yes, I mean, it made the progressive income tax way more regressive.
Right.
They were like, because that's the thing. It was like, taxes were lowered, but they were lowered the most for the highest tax brackets. So those that benefited the most were the richest. That's just, by the statistics. And so I think one thing is, again, right, like, the context of U.S. spending. If we were at a time where we had a well-budgeted budget, if we had a good budget and a good handle on our deficit, then maybe these tax cuts would be more palatable to someone like myself. But right now, it's not the case. Trump has been, the Trump administration has been increasing the deficit way more than he promised he would, and it's kind of thing of like we're lowering taxes in a time where the economy is already pretty good, and we're spending more and more at the federal level, and it's like that just seems backwards to me.
Yeah.
I feel like if the economy was bad, then maybe lowering taxes would be a good boost to the economy, but it's not like it needed it. You know what I mean? It's just a strange timing, and it's a strange way to go about something.
Well, I think it's just, I mean, to me, at least on the political science side, it just points out the inevitable fact about being a Republican president is that, I mean, I think Trump was genuine when he went in there and said he wanted to drain the swamp and, help the middle American workers, because it's very clear that's the majority of his base.
Right.
But the problem is that I think it's just inherent that the Republicans are tied to corporations.
Yeah.
And so it's just, even if he did actually want to reinvigorate the economy and help middle America workers, that's just not how the Republican Party functions right now.
Yeah, it's very obvious that he's very buddy with, large businessmen. I mean, the head of the EPA used to work for a fossil fuel company, and it's like it's just gotten ridiculous. And like you said, I mean, it's obvious that these tax cuts are benefiting the rich the most. And then, you could say, they're also, I guess, technically benefiting others too. But are those really, if like, did we need to be focusing on the top tax bracket more so than the lower tax bracket? It just seems backwards. Right. It seems backwards to me.
Well, like you said, I mean, it's just a short term. Pretty much every policy is short term, but trying to do it long term. Everything from the tariffs against China to the tax cuts. I think everything is just being framed as a long-term solution with short-term ideas. So I don't know. I feel like we have to touch on this really fast before we go. The comments on the squad this week. It's just such a prevalent topic right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just, I don't know. What do you think?
I think what he tweeted, that send them, go back to the crime-ridden countries where you came from, was just completely inappropriate and disrespectful. And I do agree that it's racially insensitive, right? It's not something you've heard said about other congressmen or women who are white. Like, it's obvious that, it was targeted at Aman Omar, right? She was the only one of the four that was actually born in a different country, but she's now a U.S. citizen through and through. I think it's just, it's really disappointing. It's disappointing that it's even gotten to this point, right? That I don't know, throughout history, that term, go back to where you came from, get out of here, go back, has always been racially charged or ethnically charged. It's always been about the other. You don't belong here with us, so go back to where you came from. And the fact that he said that about sitting U.S. congresswomen is disgusting. I mean, whatever you think about the squad, right? And, some of the squad have said some things that a lot of people don't like either. I think Omar has said something that was considered anti-Semitic. But guess what happened is she got reprimanded by Congress. They put out a little, written warning thing that said, we will not say anything anti-Semitic. She was definitely called out on it. So when Trump says they've said things that no one cared about, that's not true. Congress actually did call out Congresswoman Omar about her comments about Israeli influence in politics. And so, yeah, whether or not she had said something you might view as anti-Semitic, it still doesn't mean you can tell her to go back to her crime-ridden country, especially when the other three that were mentioned were born in Detroit and Brooklyn. It's ridiculous, and it's just a shame that now the whole world just saw how disappointing our American politics can really be.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty well put, and I just find the response of a lot of Republicans is interesting. I think it was xenophobic, but I don't think it was racist. I mean, I don't know about you, but I do feel like most of the time xenophobia is tied with at least racially tinged views,
Sure,
and
yeah, absolutely.
And I guess I'm more sympathetic to the conservatives on this one, because I guess just personally, I am not at all enamored by the squad. And I've talked to a lot of middle-aged to older Democrats who all are just find them despicable for the party. I just find their rhetoric to be, I always say it, I think Trump brought out the worst in a lot of people. And that's probably one of the worst things that I think will go down in his presidency. And I'm not saying the squad are bad women on a personal level, but I think some of the things in their combativeness as well is only something you would see after Trump. And I just don't know if I even find them genuine, to be honest. I think that a lot of what they're doing is kind of just trying to play Trump somewhat at his own game. And unfortunately, though, a lot of millennials really like them.
Sure,
they're really popular.
I'm not a huge fan of the squad either. I mean, but that's no excuse, right? That's no excuse to tell them to go back to their countries,
right?
And so, yeah.
See, I have a theory.
You should debate them on policy. If you think if someone thinks AOC is an idiot, then explain how is her policies bad. Go on that, but you can't say, you don't deserve to be in Congress. You should go back to your country. You can't, because right, the way it was worded was like they came here and they're not telling us what to do. It's like, no, they're American citizens that got elected, democratically elected to their office, and they're acting in their office's capacity. You might not like it, and that's fine, but you can't say that they don't deserve or they should go back or they're illegitimately there or they're not part of the us, right? They're American citizens.
Oh, completely. And I have two theories on why he did I guess three theories on why he did the tweet. The first one is obvious, that maybe he's trying to appeal to his part of his base that is actually racist. But I think the more likely is that they passed that sweeping reform on asylum a couple days ago,
right?
Where you have to first apply in the country closest to the one you came from and show that you were declined.
We mentioned that in episode 2, by the way, guys, a little briefly, but we did mention that episode 2, so check that out if you want to hear more about that. All right, keep going.
And yeah, so I actually think he did this to take the limelight off of this controversial change in asylum policy that might violate the human rights and several amnesty policies in the UN. I've heard some talk about that, but I think he did this because I don't know about you, but I have not seen any news outlets talk about this.
No, it was incredibly smart as a distraction, and it also, I think Trump also wants to paint the squad as the face of the Democratic Party.
Amen. And yeah, that was my second theory, is that he knows he has 45% popularity, and he wants to keep them. And it's clear that almost all Republicans do not like the squad, right? So what do? You paint them as the face, and you hope to get people like my dad and other moderate Democrats who don't want to vote for them.
Yeah, put the squad in the news as much as possible. Make the squad more popular than Nancy Pelosi, and there you go. Then you can say you have an extremist left-wing party. It's politically smart, but it's also just, it's politically smart what he did, but that doesn't mean it's not despicable in every way.
Right. And I think things could get worse. I mean, someone said this next election is going to be more racially flavored than the last one, if that's possible. So I think we might be in for a lot.
We'll see. Hopefully not, but I wouldn't be surprised, unfortunately.
Me neither. Well, I think this has been a great conversation today. I've enjoyed this.
Yes, and even with a full over an hour, I feel like we just barely scratched the surface. I'm sure each one of these topics we'll delve into again at some point. Guys, thank you for listening. Again, I'm Drew Nepley. My colleague here is Alex Kapitko. We are so excited to be doing this podcast. We have a lot of cool topics coming up in the future. We want to talk about, Roe versus Wade and the current judicial and Supreme Court and judicial system. We want to talk about deplatforming on social media. We want to cover so much, and we hope you guys join us to do that in the future. Anything else you wanted to say, Alex, before we get out of here?
Yeah, so we're going to be working on getting more publicity, more advertising, but for the moment, you can find us on YouTube at The Tonic Accord, Instagram, The Tonic Accord, Facebook, The Tonic Accord, Apple Podcasts, and also our website, thetonicaccord.com. So please give us feedback, because the more we hear from you guys, the more we grow and the better the episode can be. But until next time, let's keep our minds open and keep listening to the other side.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.